Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update.
Hello and welcome to the Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we will be analyzing the important news appearing in the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 2nd July 2020. The topics to be discussed today are reflected on your screen and the timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. So let's begin. Now this news appears as an article on page number 6 titled Striking Blow Against Assam's Inclusive Ethos. Now the context of the news is that recently the Assam government has passed a law where it has made the Assamese language compulsory in all the educational institutions starting from class 1 to class 10. Hence now in all schools including private, public and even Kendra Vidyalaya, Assamese language will be taught as one of these subjects. However, this new law is not applicable in Barak Valley, Bodoland and all the other 6 scheduled areas. In Barak Valley, Bengali will continue to prevail and in Bodoland, Bodo language will continue to prevail. Therefore, with respect to this context, in this article, the author is trying to put forth his point that this move by the Assamese government clearly goes against the discourse of Assamese nationalism and in a way it is being used to lead to homogenization of Assam. And this move by the Assamese government will have a great impact on tribal language and their culture. In this article, the author is making 3-4 points. We will try to look at them in a very summary format. So the first thing which the author is saying that the government, not just in Assam but in entire India, have always used statistical data, especially census, as a way or a mean to construct a linguistic hierarchy and homogenization of cultures. Then he gives us the example of North India, where through the census exercise, the government tried to create a wedge between the Hindi and Urdu speaking communities, where the government tried to create a narrative where they said that it is the Muslims who usually speak Urdu and while the Hindus speak Hindi, thereby creating a communal split of Hindu and Urdu. Similarly, through this politics of marginalizing languages, various languages such as Magadhi, Awadh, Bhojpuri, Garhwali, etc., which enjoy very rich linguistic traditions and literature, have also been left as a mere dialects of Hindi language. And now this similar approach is being used in Assam as well. Now the government of Assam has used the census data to portray a danger to the Assamese language. And especially they have created a narrative where they are saying that Assamese language is in danger due to the infiltration of the Bengali speaking communities. As you must be knowing, after 1971 there was a lot of migrants who came into Assam from the now Bangladesh, and since then this issue of illegal migrants has been going on, which of late took a very ugly shape in the form of the NRC exercise which was carried out in Assam. Now as for the government, in 2011 only 48.3% of the people spoke Assamese. And this number of 48.3 is very low when we compare it to the 1971 census where almost 60% of people were speaking Assamese. Therefore, they have used these figures to create a narrative where they are saying that the number of Assamese speaking people have considerably declined in the last 4 decades. However, the author is of the opinion that this entire data of the census has to be looked in an empirical manner. He then goes on to give a personal example of his tribe, which is the Mishing tribe. Now, the author is of the opinion a lot of tribes in Assam, including his own Mishing tribe, a large majority of people in those tribes actually speak Assamese language very fluently because Assamese is the dominant market language. However, when the census people come, these tribal people return their own respective languages as their mother tongue. So what he's trying to say is that almost all people, including the tribal communities, speak very fluent Assamese, but during the census exercise, they give their own language as their mother tongue, and it is due to this that the figure of the Assamese speaking people has reduced. Moving ahead, he also thinks that the reason for this change in the Assamese national discourse is also the anti-CAA protests which have been going on in Assam. Now, as you must be knowing, Assam was against the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019 because according to them, this act goes against the Assam Accord. Now, the Assamese people are of the opinion that since the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019 is making the nationalization process for the 6 minority communities a lot more easy, they feel that these communities will come and settle in Assam because they will be granted citizenship, and then this in turn will be a danger to the Assam's culture, including its language. Next, the author is talking about the impact of this move on the tribal languages. He says the effect, of course, will be very adverse and negative, especially on those tribal languages which are not enjoying any kind of constitutional protection. Now, as per the constitution, under the age schedule, we have given constitutional protection to only 22 languages. Furthermore, the author is saying that already the speakers of these tribal or native languages is on decline. And to support his argument, he has given us various figures from the data of 2001 and 2011, comparing the downfall in the number of speakers who used to speak various tribal languages, including tribes such as Deori, Mishings, Rabhas, etc. Next, he says that the tribal communities since long have already been demanding territorial as well as linguistic protection and proper attention from the state government. However, in return, they are only getting a mere hogwash from the state government. For example, after a long struggle by the Mishing community, in 1985 the government of Assam came out with a gazette notification where it stated that the Mishing language will be made as an additional subject in class 3rd and class 4th in all those areas dominated by the Mishing tribe. Furthermore, the Assam government was also supposed to take up various efforts to appoint a Mishing language teacher, translate books into the Mishing language, etc. However, the efforts of the government towards this initiative have been very half-hearted. Next, author is of the opinion that tribal communities always have resisted such forced efforts of homogenization. In fact, he says that it was in response to the Official Language Bill of 1969 that the Khasi community protested, and this ultimately led to the formation of the state of Meghalaya. Furthermore, even the Bodoland movement has found its root in this Official Language Bill of 1960, which wanted to make Assamese as the official language of the state government of Assam. However, here the author is saying that despite all these efforts by the Assam government, the tribal communities of Assam have always supported the Assamese movement against Bengali and Hindi languages. So even though the tribal people say that the Assamese national discourse is very narrow and does not include other tribal communities and only focuses on Assamese language and the culture of Assam, however, despite all this, tribes such as the Mishings, Deoris and Rabhas always supported the Assamese movement against the imposition of Bengali language or Hindi in Assam. However, now the government has turned against these communities only and are making and contemplating such laws which will lead to their further marginalization. In fact, the state government from the beginning of this year is also ruminating on this idea that it wants to make Assamese as mandatory if anybody wants to get a government job in Assam. That is to say, till matriculation, that is till 10th standard, a person has to study Assamese as one language if they want to apply for government jobs in Assam. Therefore, by bringing in such laws, the state government is trying to overcome the crisis created by the CEA. However, the author has cautioned and warned that all these movements will only increase the marginalization of these communities and will trigger social conflicts once again in Assam. And as much as the tribal people acknowledge the threat that infiltration poses to local language and culture, these tribal people are also very cautious of the Assamese hegemony and homogeneity which it is trying to impose on these tribal people. So this was all what this article was saying. A connected topic here is Article 350. Now, Article 350 was added via the 7th Constitutional Amendment Act of 1956, and this article has stated that every state government and every local authority will have to provide adequate facilities so that the children who belong to the linguistic minority communities can be instructed or taught in their mother tongue at least in the primary stage of education. And to give effect to this endeavor, the President has been given the authority that he may issue such directions to any state if he considers it necessary. Now, this is not exactly related to this article because here the Assam government has passed a law where it is saying that Assamese will be taught as one of the subjects till standard 10th. Since this article is related to language, I thought you should know about Article 350A. So this was all this editorial was talking about. With this, let's take up our next news. Now this news has been taken from page number 15 and it reads, SBI unit to set up SPV for aiding NBFCs on liquidity. Now the government has announced a special liquidity window worth rupees 30,000 crores for the NBFC. But before we talk more about the special liquidity scheme, let us understand one basic thing about how NBFCs function. Now NBFCs and housing finance companies are basically financial intermediaries. And as financial intermediaries, what these NBFCs and HFCs do is that they issue commercial paper to various institutions such as banks and financial institutions, etc. And in return of issuing these commercial paper, they get money from these institutions. And then whatever money they are getting, they use this borrowed money to give loans to their various customers who can be X, Y, Z. So this is how money flows in an NBFC. Now what has happened is that due to COVID-19, various businesses have been adversely affected, and due to this, these businesses are unable to give back their loans to the NBFC, thereby affecting the cash flow to the NBFCs and the HFCs. So now since these customers are not paying back on the loans, the NBFCs and the HFCs themselves do not have any money to fulfill their repayment obligations on the commercial papers. Obviously, since these NBFCs issued commercial papers, they have to return back that money with certain interest. But now since NBFCs do not have money, they are unable to fulfill their repayment obligation. And this, if it continues for more time, can lead to default by these NBFCs. Hence, in order to prevent this default by the NBFCs and the HFCs, and in order to improve their liquidity position, the government has announced a special liquidity window worth rupees 30,000 crores. Now this initiative is known as the Special Liquidity Scheme. Now the SBI Cap, which is a subsidiary of the State Bank of India, has set up a special purpose vehicle known as the Special Liquidity Scheme Trust or the SLS Trust. And it is this SLS Trust which will manage this operation. Now let us understand how things will work with help of this flowchart. Now this SLS Trust will raise money by issuing special securities to the RBI. So here, first the SLS will issue certain special securities to the RBI, and for these securities, RBI will provide a 30,000 crore loan to SLS Trust. So in the first phase, you see 30,000 crores will move from RBI to SLS Trust in return of the special securities issued by the SLS. Now here you need to remember is that these securities which the SLS is issuing are guaranteed by the Government of India. So these are basically government guaranteed special securities. Then in the second phase, what will happen is that this SLS Trust will purchase commercial papers of the NBFCs. So as we studied in the beginning, the NBFCs issues commercial papers in order to raise money. So NBFCs will sell commercial papers to this SLS Trust, and in return of these commercial papers, SLS Trust will give money to NBFC. And which money will SLS Trust give? The same money which it got from RBI, that is 30,000 crores. Now these commercial papers issued by the NBFCs will have the maximum maturity of 90 days. So through this process, by selling its commercial papers, the NBFCs will be able to get money from the SLS Trust, and then whatever money they have borrowed from the SLS Trust, they will use this borrowed money to pay back their existing liabilities. Please remember here that this money borrowed from the SLS Trust is only to be used to extinguish the existing liabilities. NBFCs cannot use this borrowed money from SLS Trust to give out new loans or for any other kind of purpose. The only purpose is that NBFCs should be able to pay back their already existing obligations. So hence the process is very simple. SLS will first raise money by issuing special securities to RBI, and these special securities will be government guaranteed. And then the 30,000 crores which SLS will raise, this money SLS will give to NBFCs by purchasing certain commercial papers from these NBFCs. And then NBFCs will get their money, and this borrowed money they will use only to pay back their existing liabilities and not for any other purpose. Lastly, this scheme has certain benefits. Now, as I stated earlier, if the NBFCs and the HFCs do not pay back the money which they have borrowed from these bank or other financial institution, there will always linger a possibility that they can default on repayment of loans, and this default by the NBFCs would then lead to a certain financial contagion. Because please understand that the NBFC is borrowing money from banks and financial institutions. So if NBFC is unable to pay back this money, of course the liquidity and the financial stability of banks and financial institutions will also be compromised. Hence, the liquidity problem of NBFCs could then spread to other financial institutions and bank as well, and this is known as financial contagion. So the first purpose of this scheme was to avoid the potential risk of a financial contagion which would have happened if NBFCs would have defaulted. Secondly, this will improve the liquidity flow of the NBFCs. Now, whatever money which the NBFCs were getting, all this money they were using to repay back their obligations. But now, since this money which they will get from the SLS trust, they will use that money to repay back their obligations. So whatever money which is left by them, that money the NBFCs can use to create new credit. And hence this process will also kickstart the credit creation in our economy. Therefore, the scheme has these three major benefits. Now, please keep in mind that this scheme is only available for certain eligible NBFCs. Which NBFCs are eligible is very technical and is not important for the examination purpose. However, in the PDF, we have attached the list of the eligible beneficiaries if you want to give it a look. With this, let's take up our next news. This next news appears as an article on page number 7 titled How Not to Tame the Digital Dragon. Now, earlier this week, a press release was issued by Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology directing a ban on 59 smartphone applications, many of them web services. This included TikTok, UC Browser, CamScan, etc. Now, beyond the geopolitical and economic impact of this ban, a lot of questions have arisen as to the legality of this step and its impact on democratic norms. Hence, in this regard, we will discuss all these issues which this notification has brought to the fore, and we will also understand as to why it is important to follow the laws. Now, the first issue with respect to the ban is the lack of transparency in this notification. Now, this lack of transparency is caused due to lack of examination and debate on this decision. Now, this whole decision is supposed to have been taken on the recommendation by the Ministry of Home Affairs, but the Ministry's assessment was not deliberated upon. That is to say, on what basis did the Ministry arrive on this decision? This basis were not deliberated or discussed. Hence, the need for disclosure of these recommendations gained primacy. Second, the notification or the legal order which has banned these apps is not publicly available. So, this legal order through which this ban has been placed has not yet been published or been made publicly available. Disclosure of this order is necessary because the nature of the action to block these apps impact the right of not only the owners of these smartphone application but also impacts public's fundamental right to receive information. Hence, currently, the only publicly available document is the press release, which by itself is not a substitute for a legal order. Because obviously, banning these apps is a sanction and the government cannot arbitrarily take any decision. Whatever decision the government is taking needs to have certain kind of legal backing. But here in this case, the legal order itself is not publicly available. Third is that this is a mandatory notification. Now, the Supreme Court had clearly stated while it was examining the scope of telecommunication shutdown in J&K that a public disclosure needs to be made prior to placing any such restriction on internet access. However, in this case, No prior public disclosure was made by the government that it is going to ban such apps. Fourthly, the question is how to challenge this order if one wants to do so. Now, though already the Supreme Court in Shreya Singhal and Anuradha Bhasin cases has clearly upheld that the government has the power to block any content. However, if a person wants to approach the High Court or the Supreme Court, then that petitioner would require a legal order to challenge this decision of the government in the court. However, no legal order is available. The second major issue is related to legality of this order. Now, your section 69A of the Information Technology Act of 2000 permits the government to block information that falls within certain specific grounds that need to be invoked when it is necessary and expedient, which basically means that if it is necessary and expedient, the government has the power to block information. However, such a process requires a show cause notice to be served to the aggrieved party so that they can be given an opportunity to defend themselves. However, such kind of process has not been followed while banning these apps. Now, furthermore, the Act states that this process can be exempted if there exists a certain kind of emergency. However, if we go through the press release, there is little given in the press release which would indicate to such an emergency. Furthermore, even if there was an emergency, the press release does not state what was the specific cause for it. Hence, the author has assumed that in the absence of a particular situation being stated as an emergency, the government should have followed the normal process where it should have served a show cause notice before blocking any content or information. And lastly, the author is telling us why it is important for us as citizens of the world's largest democracy to ask these questions. Now, the principle of legality is very inherent to a democracy, and a democracy is actually governed by laws and does not work on the whims and fancies of powerful individuals in the high offices. Therefore, India being a democracy, it should be governed by laws and not through arbitrary actions. Secondly, it is the hallmark of democracy that laws are enacted through a valid process and should not be violating fundamental rights of the citizens. However, here as we discussed, the fundamental rights of not only the individuals using these applications was violated to a certain extent, but also the rights of the owners of these applications was violated as they were not given any opportunity to defend themselves. Furthermore, laws exist in a democracy to act as fetters on the powers of the government. However, if the government is trying to circumvent these laws to attain its goal, then that basically means that the government is trying to undermine the constitutional framework of our country. Lastly, the author feels that all these concerns related to privacy and data protection, if the government really wanted to address these, the government should do so by using the proper channel of legislation rather than coming out with such notifications or press releases which are not backed by any legal order. In fact, a watered down version of the Data Protection Bill is still pending before the Parliamentary Committee and awaits enactment. So, if the government is really concerned about privacy and data protection, then the government should pull up its socks and pass the Data Protection Bill. Hence, we can say that forsaking our democratic values is too high a price to pay if the goal is to neuter the designs of an aggressive single party state. To protect individual liberty and national interests, India must proceed with caution and remember the age-old adage of being careful of whom we hate, for we may end up just like them. With this, let's take up our next news. Now, this news has been taken from page number 7, titled Reforming India's Digital Policy. Now, this article highlights that Indian government must soon put in place a new architecture to provide fillip for digital services. Such an architecture should strike a balance between contrasting objectives such as right to privacy versus need to process the data, the need to protect domestic companies versus the need to attract more FDI. Furthermore, the government must also take into account the pros and cons of data localization, and ultimately, the policies have to be formulated in a manner wherein these policies should act as a key enabler for India to become a $5 trillion economy. Now, the background of this article is that COVID 19 and the lockdown imposed due to it has caused a lot of disruption between the demand and the supply side. And this mismatch in demand and supply side has impacted the entire world economy. Furthermore, as per the World Investment Report of UNCTAD, due to the negative investor sentiment, the FDI inflows to various developing countries is likely to reduce in the coming future. However, the silver lining of COVID 19 has been the fact that this COVID 19 has given an impetus to various digital services. Because due to COVID 19, we have now shifted to online education, telemedicine has come on stage, there is promotion of e commerce, e payments, etc. Hence, what we can ascertain from this fact is that our digital sector has withstood the impact and the shocks caused by the COVID 19. And hence, the government should try and come out with a policy where we can attract more FDI inflows, especially in this digital sector. Furthermore, India has always been an ideal destination for attracting FDI inflows, and now the government should maneuver its policy in such a way where the FDI inflows come in to give a boost to the Industrial Revolution 4.0. Now, as per the author, whatever new digital architecture the government comes up with, 4 questions should be answered in a very clear-cut manner. These questions are: where is the data generated? Where is the data stored? Who processes the data? And where is the data processed? Furthermore, the author says that to provide clarity on these aspects, the government is already working on 3 reform measures, which include the Personal Data Protection Bill, the e-commerce policy, and the amendment to the Information Technology Act. Let us very briefly look at these 3. Now, the Personal Data Protection Bill deals with broad guidelines on the collection, storage, and processing of personal data, the consent of the individuals, the penalties and compensation, as well as a code of conduct. Now, the first important aspect of the Data Protection Bill is the data storage and data processing. Now, the bill has classified personal data into 3 categories. First is the general personal data. Now, as far as the general personal data is concerned, the bill has stated that some of the personal data, which is not critical or sensitive in nature, can be stored and processed abroad without requiring a copy of that data to be stored in India. However, all personal data, including general, sensitive, or critical, can be processed outside India only with the consent of the person of whose data it is. The second category is critical personal data. Now, in case of personal data which is critical or very important in nature, this bill says that such critical personal data will be required to be both stored and processed in India only, that is within our national borders. And the central government has been given the authority to notify which all categories of personal data will be classified as critical personal data. The third category is sensitive personal data. Now, sensitive personal data includes data such as passwords, financial data, health data, sex life, sex orientation, genetic data, etc. Now, all this sensitive personal data shall only be stored in India. Furthermore, if this data has to be processed abroad, this can be done so only under certain conditions, that too including the approval of the Data Protection Agency. The second important aspect is related to government's power. Now, the government has been given the power to gain access to any non-personal data such as traffic patterns or demographic data if it is for the purpose of forming a policy for better delivery of services. Furthermore, the government has also been given power by this bill to access any information for the purpose of national security. Hence, you see that the government has been given a lot of power as it can access any kind of information if it is in the interest of national security. Thirdly, this bill places certain duties on intermediaries because a lot of social media companies are deemed as significant data fiduciaries because these companies have a lot of personal data stored with them. So this bill says that all these social media companies have to develop their own user verification mechanism, so that with help of this mechanism we can tackle the menace of fake news in India. Lastly, as far as processing data without consent is concerned, certain exemptions have been provided where the individual's consent is not required to process the data. And such reasonable purposes would include security of the state, detection of any unlawful activity, whistleblowing, medical emergencies, operation of search engines, etc. Furthermore, personal data processed in the interest of prevention, detection, investigation, or prosecution of any kind of offense is also exempted. The next thing which the author has mentioned is the e-commerce policy. Now, the initial e-commerce policy which was drafted provided for data localization norm. And according to this draft e-commerce policy, various companies such as Amazon, Flipkart, etc. are required to store the user's data in the servers which are physically located in India. That is, the data has to be stored in India itself. However, these companies had issues with such a norm. Therefore, right now talks are going on between the government and these e-commerce company on whether such data localization norms should be included in the e-commerce policy or not. Thirdly, the government wants to amend the IT Act of 2000. For this, the government has started interdepartmental and industry consultation to revamp the IT Act. Now, the revamping or the amendment of the IT Act is centered around three broad issues. First is how the legislation or the IT Act in particular can reconcile the difference between data privacy and the need to provide data to the government on issues related to national security. Because if on one hand the privacy of people is of utmost importance, then on the other hand even the national security and interest of India is of paramount importance, and hence we need to come out with a framework which is very clear-cut and unambiguous so that we can reconcile these two almost opposing objectives. Secondly, we need to sync the IT Act with the Personal Data Protection Bill. Of course, this will happen only if we first pass or enact the Personal Data Protection Bill. Lastly, importance has been given on new and emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, cryptocurrencies, Internet of Things, etc. And debate is going on as to how to bring these new technologies effectively under the purview of the IT Act. Now, this news appears on page number 6 as the lead article titled Police Reform and the Crucial Judicial Actor. Now, this article has been written in the context of the recent brutality by the police in the state of Tamil Nadu, which has resulted in the death of father and son inside the police lockup. Therefore, such situations of grave state brutalities committed on powerless citizens can only be rectified by judicial intervention. Hence, judiciary has become a beacon of hope not only for such powerless citizens but also to ensure that justice is delivered. Hence, in this regard, the author in this article is talking about the required police reform and the critical role played by the judiciary. Now, earlier also in the DNS dated 10th June 2020, Fezan sir has discussed in detail the various police reforms, the recommendations, the committees as well as the cases. However, considering the fact that police reform now has become a very important article, especially from the perspective of means, we will try and cover some aspects which were not covered earlier. However, if you want to prepare this topic of police reform holistically, please do refer to the DNS of 10th June. Now, this article has mentioned certain important cases as far as police reform is concerned. So, let us discuss that. Now, the Supreme Court of India has been hailed by jurists and scholars as the only institution working in favor of police reforms, and therefore Supreme Court has accordingly provided important guidelines to ensure transparency in police functioning through its various decisions. The first important case related to police reform came in the year 1994, which was Joginder Kumar versus the state of UP. Now, Joginder Kumar, a young lawyer, was illegally detained by the police for 5 days, and his family had to file a writ of habeas corpus in Supreme Court of India to know about his situation. Now, the Supreme Court in this case held that any police officer must be able to justify the reason for arresting a certain person, and this reason must be given in writing, and the person so detained by the police officer has to be produced in front of the nearest magistrate within 24 hours. Furthermore, Supreme Court also held that no arrest can be made in a routine manner on a mere allegation of commission of an offence. Hence, in this regard, the Supreme Court laid emphasis on Article 21 and 22. The second important case came in 1997 in the form of D.K. Basu versus the state of West Bengal. Now, here the Supreme Court laid down certain basic requirements which a police officer needs to follow in every case of arrest and detention. Firstly, the police officer who is carrying out the arrest, detention, or interrogation should wear accurate, visible, and clear identification and a clear name tag. Furthermore, as soon as a person is detained or arrested, his family must be informed as soon as possible after the arrest. Furthermore, the police officer who is handling such an interrogation, his record must be put in a register. Next, the person who has been arrested must be made aware of this right that he can inform someone of his arrest or detention. Additionally, an entry must also be made in the diary at the place of detention regarding the arrest of the person, and the name and particular of the police officer also in whose custody the person who has been arrested is staying should also be registered. Lastly, copy of all these memo of arrest etc. should be sent to the magistrate for his record. Now, through these two cases of Joginder Kumar and D.K. Basu, the Supreme Court highlighted the aspect of right to life and right to be informed. Through these guidelines, the Supreme Court sought to curb the power of arrest as well as ensure that an accused person is made aware of all the critical information regarding his or her arrest. Now, these guidelines laid down in these two cases became the part of the Code of Criminal Procedure in the year 2008 when the CRPC was amended. Now, after almost a decade of these two cases, in 2006 came the case of Prakash Singh. Now, Prakash Singh was the former DGP of police and he filed a petition in the Supreme Court and sought major changes to the police structure. Now, he stressed on the autonomy and appealed for police professionalism. And following his petition, the Supreme Court gave a number of orders, including fixation of tenure of senior police officer, setting up of a state security commission, mandated for a new police act based on the model act prepared by the union government, which was to be then circulated amongst various state governments. Now, the efforts which were made after this case led to the government constituting new committee under the chairmanship of Julio Ribeiro in 1998. Now, this committee was then followed by further committees, Padmanabh Bhai Committee, Malimat Committee, Soli Sorabji Committee, etc. So, please remember the name of these committees. These are associated with police reforms and can be asked in the prelims. Now, another important aspect was that the Supreme Court stated that the police reform has to be a mandatory reform which has to be taken up by both the central and the state government. Next, after this judgment, Supreme Court set up three institutions at the state level, namely the State Security Commission, in order to protect the police personnel from outside influences. Second was the Police Establishment Board to give police certain functional autonomy and independence. Third was the Police Complaints Authority to ensure its accountability and help with grievance redressal. Then Supreme Court also said that the DGP should be selected by the state government from amongst the three senior most officers of the department impaneled, and such DGP should have a minimum of 2 years of tenure. Then it also stated that 2 years of tenure should also be given for police officers on operational duties in the field. Now, this next is a very important aspect which the Supreme Court highlighted, which the author next has also spoken about in this article, which was that we need to separate the investigation and the law and order function of the police for better investigation and better expertise. Furthermore, the Union government also set up a National Security Commission whose main purpose was selection and placement of heads of Central Police Organization. So these were the recommendation of the Prakash Singh case. Now this brings us to the next important aspect, which is the importance of separating the investigation and the law and order function of the police. Now usually investigations are very poorly done, slow, and it is done by police personnel who are very inadequately trained and are not even specialists in what they are doing. In fact, many a time the police personnel which are meant for investigation, due to shortage of manpower, are sent to carry on other law and order duties. But what we need to realize is that both investigation and law and order are vital and important functions of the police which need to be carried out in a dedicated manner. Therefore, the author is of the opinion that we need to encourage specialization and upgrade the overall performance. For this, the Supreme Court in the Prakash Singh case has stated that there should be a gradual separation of the investigative and the law and order function of the police. The court felt that this will help to streamline policing and ensure speedier and more expert investigation. Now, though the Supreme Court has said that both these functions have to be separated, however, in reality, this separation is yet to take place. Now, the author in this article is saying that despite these various judicial guidelines and reminders, police functioning is still unaccountable at many levels, and this results in such kind of violence, including custodial death, as we witnessed in Tamil Nadu. Not only there is apathy from police and state machinery as a whole, but also the judiciary's approach of simply passing directions and guidelines has in a way proven to be a failure. As per the author, it is ultimately upon the judicial magistrate who hears the arrest petition within 24 hours to decide the fate of the person accused of a crime. And the failure to ensure compliance of the judgment has made judiciary comparatively weak, as certain laws declared as unconstitutional are still followed by the lower police officials in India. Hence, in this regard, the author has expressed a certain way forward. He says that rather than passing more and more guidelines, the court must seriously concentrate on cases that come their way and expose how hard it is for a common man to get justice, especially against police. Furthermore, the courts should not defend police brutality in the name of low morale of the police. Now, the Madras High Court stated while dealing with this case that this incident was a result of certain few bad apples in the system which are now ruining the entire system's reputation. However, the author does not agree with Madras High Court's comment because he feels even if this is true, these few bad apples must not let the system rot, and they must be duly punished according to the procedure established by law. And lastly, it is time to consider sanctions at a much larger scale and also to impose some kind of monetary penalties at district level in order to drive home the point that such actions or wrongs of one police officer will affect the entire force itself. Lastly, the author is also stating that rather than just passing down guidelines, Supreme Court now must focus on the judicial magistrate. Because what happens in reality is that the judicial magistrate is often in a rush to get done with the remand cases because he already has so many cases pending in front of him. So rather than treating an arrested person with care and listening to his case properly with full attention and consideration, the judicial magistrate in a hurry just gets done with the remand case. Now here you cannot totally blame the judicial magistrate because it is not his fault that he is overburdened. But here the fault is that this entire system is a big systemic failure, and it is the constitutional courts which are indirectly responsible for this systemic failure because they are not focusing on the fact that judicial magistrates have so much of workload. Hence, in conclusion, the author says that the constitutional court must focus on the function of the judicial magistrate because it is the judicial magistrate only in front of whom the police produces the accused person within 24 hours. And since this judicial magistrate is the first point of contact for a citizen, as per the constitutional rule of law under Article 2, much focus should be given on the functioning of the judicial magistrate. So this was all what this article was stating. Please refer to the DNS of 10th June to have much more holistic idea about this topic. With this, let's take up our next news. Now, this news has been taken from page number 15 and it is with respect to surety bonds. Now, the context of the news is that recently the Union Ministry of Road Transport and Highways had requested the insurance regulator IRDAI to examine the possibility of insurance companies offering surety bonds to ensure completion of the highway projects by the contractors. In this regard, IRDAI has constituted a working group to study the suitability of insurance companies offering surety bonds for contractors. In this regard, let us see what exactly are surety bonds. Now, surety bond is a form of contractual agreement between three parties. Principal will be the contractor who undertakes the contract to make roads. Second is the obligee, that is the government. And third is the surety, that is the insurance company who is giving the surety. Now, in this agreement, what happens is that the surety company gives an undertaking that if the contractor does not complete the project as per the timeline, keeping in mind all the requirements, then the surety, that is the insurance company, will pay the amount to the government. So if the contractor fails to complete the project on time and does not fulfill his requirement laid down by the government, the surety company comes into picture and is required to compensate the obligee or the government for the loss. Now, as of now, these surety bonds are very famous in US, UK and Australia, and therefore now even India is trying to create an enabling framework where we can see whether it is feasible for the insurance companies to act as a surety in such cases and to issue surety bonds. Now let us see the working mechanism of the surety bond. Now let's say the National Highway Authority of India wants to award the construction of a national highway project to a particular private company, let's say the ABC company. Now the NHIA will lay down all the specifications and even the timeline and the requirement it requires for the completion of the project. Hence, NHIA will insist that this company should provide a surety bond of, let's say, 1,000 crores. Now this private sector company, ABC, will buy this surety bond from an insurance company. Now there are several ways in which surety bonds work. However, we will discuss one example here. Now, for example, these bonds are not bought at face value. So it is not that the bond is for 1,000 crores, so the company, that is the ABC company, will pay 1,000 crores to the insurance company. No. What will happen is that these bonds will be bought at a premium of around 1 to 10%, depending upon the company's or the contractor's financial strength, credit history, experience in execution of projects, etc. So let's say here, for example, this ABC company buys a bond of 1,000 crores at 2% premium. So that means this company is paying 2 crores to this insurance company and buying this surety bond. Now this surety bond will then be presented to NHAI, leading to the award of this highway project to the company ABC. Now in the future, if the private sector company ABC fails to adhere to the timelines or the specification, then this insurance company will compensate and pay 1,000 crores to NHAI. So this is one of the ways how an surety bond works. Next, let us see what will be the benefits if such surety bonds are allowed in India. Now currently the system is that the National Highway Authority of India requires the contractors to furnish a bank guarantee if the companies want that a highway project should be awarded to them. Now in case the contractor fails to adhere to the contract, then in that case the banks are required to compensate the government for the loss. However, what this thing does is that it puts a lot of pressure on the banking sector in our country. And already the banking sector is reeling under the problem of NPA and liquidity crunch. Therefore, it is felt that we need to create an enabling framework for surety bonds, because this will reduce the burden on the banks and will also help the contractors to avail surety from insurance companies. Secondly, this kind of surety bonds will provide a fillip to the insurance sectors, because obviously if the surety bonds come into picture, various companies will then be giving premium to the insurance company in order to buy these surety bonds. And as you must be knowing, the insurance companies work on premium itself. So if surety bonds come in, the insurance sector too will get a lot of boost. Lastly, of course, it has the advantage of creating better infrastructure for India, because surety bonds will ensure that highway projects are completed on time without any delay or cost escalation. Hence, it is a win-win situation for all the three parties, that is the government, the contractor and the insurance companies. With this, let's take up our next news. Now, this news has been taken from page number 10, titled Ministry Reconstitutes Central Zoo Authority. Now, the context of the news is that recently the Environment Ministry has reconstituted the Central Zoo Authority in order to include an expert from the School of Planning and Architecture as well as a molecular biologist. Now, this topic of Central Zoo Authority is not really important because it is not a significant topic. However, since we have never covered this before, I think it is okay to give 2 minutes to it. Now, this Central Zoo Authority is a statutory body because it has been constituted under the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. This authority was established in the year 1992 and functions under the Ministry of Environment and Forest. The chairman of this Central Zoo Authority is the Union Minister of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, and apart from the chairman, it has other 10 members as well as a member secretary. Now, the important function of this Central Zoo Authority is that every zoo in the country, if it wants to operate, it has to obtain recognition from this Central Zoo Authority. Furthermore, if India wants to exchange animals between itself and foreign zoos, then this too also has to be approved by the authority before the requisite clearances can be given. So this is all about the Central Zoo Authority. Let's take up our next news. Now, this news appears on page number 11, titled Mamata Writes to Niti Aayog on Sundarban. Now, Chief Minister of West Bengal, Mamata Banerjee, has written to Niti Aayog's Vice Chairman asking for a master plan for the socio-economic development of the Sundarbans. Now, I have spoken about Sundarbans earlier also in detail when the Indian Sundarbans got the tag of wetland of international importance. So, let us revise that lecture. And is in the context of the recently accorded status of wetland of international importance to the Indian Sundarbans under the Ramsar Convention. From the perspective of a syllabus, it will fall under GS Paper 3 in the category of conservation, and with respect to your prelims, in addition to falling under environment, this topic can also fall under geography. As mentioned earlier, the Indian Sundarbans, which are mangrove forests, have been accorded the status of wetland of international importance under the Ramsar Convention. Let us know a few things about the Sundarbans. Now, as far as the geographical location of the Sundarbans is concerned, they are located in the southwestern part of the Ganga and Brahmaputra Delta at the mouth of the Bay of Bengal in the country of India and Bangladesh. Hence, the Sundarbans are shared between India and Bangladesh, wherein 60% of these mangrove forests lie with Bangladesh and 40% lies in India. Further, the Sundarbans are the home to the Royal Bengal tiger. In fact, these Sundarbans are the only mangrove forest in the world where tigers are found. In addition to hosting the Royal Bengal tiger, Sundarban is also home to various rare and globally threatened species such as the northern raven terrapin, which is currently classified as critically endangered as per the IUCN. Second is the Irrawaddy dolphin, whose IUCN status is endangered, and another example of a rare species is the fishing cat, which is currently vulnerable. Apart from these, Sundarban is also home to numerous faunal species and 90% of country's mangrove varieties. The Sundarbans have also been given the tag of UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the Indian Sundarban is the 27th Ramsar site in India and is now the largest protected wetland in the country as well. Moving ahead, this article has listed certain threats to the Sundarbans. The first is the anthropogenic pressures. Huge population of that area is putting additional pressure on this ecosystem of the Sundarban. Secondly, Sundarban also faces certain high impact threats like fishing and harvesting of other aquatic resources and other activities like grudging, oil and gas drilling, etc. Thirdly, Sundarban also faces certain low impact threat like increasing tourism. In addition to these three, other threats like logging and wood harvesting, hunting and collecting of terrestrial animals also exist. Now, this article has given us what can be the significance for the Sundarbans on achieving the status of international importance. First is that it will help to highlight the conservation issues of the Sundarban at the international level. Secondly, this will lead to an improved international cooperation between India and Bangladesh for the protection of this unique ecosystem. Lastly, this status could lead to better conservation strategies for various flagship species like the tiger, Irrawaddy dolphin, etc. Now, as far as the Ramsar Convention is concerned, its full name is Convention on Wetlands of International Importance, and it is an international treaty signed for the conservation and sustainable use of wetlands. An important fact about this Ramsar Convention is that it is the only global treaty which focuses on a single ecosystem, which is to say that various other conservation and ecological conventions focus on broad areas which might have more than one ecosystem. But this Ramsar Convention is the only global treaty which focuses on a single ecosystem, that is of wetlands. This Ramsar Convention was adopted in the Iranian city of Ramsar in the year 1971 and came into force in the year 1975. Now, the reason why a specific convention on the conservation of wetland was required is because wetlands are very important as they provide fresh water and food. In addition, the wetlands also serve as nature's shock absorber because most of the wetlands serve as an ecotone. Another very important fact to remember with this news is that the part of the Sundarban Delta which lies in the Bangladesh, also known as the Bangladesh Sundarbans, they got the status of international importance in the year 1992 itself. So this current status which has been accorded has been given specifically to the Indian Sundarbans. So now with the Indian Sundarbans also getting the same status, the whole of the Sundarban now is a wetland of international importance. Now let us take a look at the summary of some other important articles. The first one is given at page number 8, where it is stating that the Eravi Perur Gram Panchayat in Kerala has successfully deployed robot nurses named Asha at COVID-19 first line treatment center. Now this they had to do after an Asha worker in the district tested positive for the COVID-19. So the Panchayat thought that it is important to explore new ways in order to ensure adequate protection to the health workers at the hospital. Now this Eravi Perur Gram was also the first Gram Panchayat in the country to receive the National Award for Public Administration in April 2015. And it is also the first Panchayat in the state of Kerala to get ISO 9001 certification for its primary health center. The second important news is on page number 10, titled Convalescent Plasma for Those Not Responding to Steroids. Now, convalescent plasma is basically the antibody-rich plasma of someone who has recovered from a certain virus, in this case COVID-19. Now, usually this convalescent plasma is given to people who have severe COVID-19 in order to boost their ability to fight the virus. Hence, now the government has stated that all those people who are not responding to steroids and other medication will be given convalescent plasma therapy. Now, this convalescent plasma therapy is plasma only donation, which means that the liquid or the plasma portion of the donor's blood cell is separated from the cells, and then the red blood cells and the platelets are returned to the donor along with some saline, and only the plasma of that donor is taken. The next important news is on page number 14, in respect to West Bank. Now, since Israel wants to bring 30% of the territory under its control, Israel is planning to annex part of the occupied West Bank. Now, the British Prime Minister has already requested Israel to not do so and go ahead with this plan. Furthermore, even some of the closest allies of Israel are condemning Israel for such a plan. Now, from the perspective of our examination, the location of West Bank becomes important. Now, West Bank is located in Israel. Now, as you can see, it occupies the western portion of Israel. Now, this West Bank is a landlocked territory bordered by Jordan in the east and Israel on the south, west and north. Now, this West Bank was captured by Jordan after the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. And then during the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel snatched it back from Jordan and has occupied West Bank ever since. With this, we come to an end for today's discussion. Let's take up the question for the day.